Okay, so I have to be really clear when I tell you why I'm making this video in the first place. If you go over onto Twitter, you can find a few tweets that really open your eyes as to how scouted the 2020 NHL Draft is. Here is an article from the Montreal Gazette from July 2nd, and here are some quotes from Shane Wright's parents that are included in this piece. "I deleted Twitter," Simon Wright said. "It's out of control." Tanya Wright said, "I wasn't prepared. If every kid was scouted to the same degree as Shane, you could pick apart any player." That was a real eye-opener. Now, what exactly are Shane Wright's parents talking about? Well, they're talking about the fact that their son, Shane Wright, is pretty much the talk of the town when it comes to a few hockey markets, Montreal specifically, since they have the first overall pick. And you have yourselves a few people that are in the Montreal hockey sphere, I guess you could say, that are doing their best to either bring Shane Wright up or bring Shane Wright down, talk about why Slafkovsky is better, talk about why Cooley is worse, and all this stuff. It's crazy the amount of discourse we have about draft prospects, kids that are 17, 18 years old, and the fact that we're so willing to talk about them in a way that kind of dehumanizes them, sort of, online. That's why Shane Wright's parents went out there and deleted Twitter. Now, I don't need to go out there and explain myself when I say this sentence right here, but one of the bigger personalities in Montreal hockey conversation the past few years has been Grant McCagg. He is a former scout at the NHL level, and he has been one of the main guys on Twitter specifically who has been on the anti-Wright train. Okay, maybe that's a dramatic way to say it, but for all intents and purposes, let's just say it just because it sounds cool. He's said a few times that he doesn't really care if Shane Wright goes 1 or 2 or whatever, but in his opinion, Shane Wright is not the best player in the draft. He is not the best prospect. He should not be number 1. He's gone on several Twitter threads analyzing individual parts of Shane Wright's game. He even made a compilation video about how lazy Shane Wright is on plays where he's not back-checking, and that sort of went viral, and it wasn't really all too great for people that wanted to believe in Shane Wright. And because Grant McCagg has been such a vocal personality about how he would rather have Slafkovsky over Wright, it's led to a lot of Canadiens fans to go out there and talk about some other takes that Grant McCagg has had as well. Takes throughout the past that have been either pretty noteworthy because of how ridiculous they are, and noteworthy strictly because of how incorrect some of his assessments could be. Now, this is not a personal attack on Grant McCagg, it's just an idea that I thought was interesting enough to talk about, which is why we're going over onto the Canadian subreddit and talking about a post made by Yeeteridu, that's what it is. Pretty interesting username right there. Here's a Grant McCagg compilation with the fire emoji. By the way, the Strome tweet isn't fake, he just deleted it. In this post, there are 9 individual Grant McCagg quotes, and they all have some pretty juicy conversations within them. We can probably make a few videos on these ideas heading into the next few weeks because, off-season, we don't really have anything else to talk about. But the first tweet that is in this post, the Strome tweet that was deleted, it's a pretty hot take, which is why we're making this video. Let's go back to March 9th, 2015, before the 2015 NHL Entry Draft came along, where you had McDavid and Eichel battling it out for 1 and 2. Well, okay, it was pretty much just McDavid and Eichel being 1 and 2, but the media made a bigger deal out of it than they probably should have. But Grant McCagg, former NHL scout, said this: "I honestly have Dylan Strome over Connor McDavid. People will laugh now, but come back to me in a couple of years and see who's laughing." Now, I will say this last part, see who's laughing, come back to me in a couple of years. That's sort of the language that McCagg uses sometimes when he makes these quotes. Even for some of the Wright and Slafkovsky stuff, there is a little bit of hostility towards anybody that disagrees with his ideas, and anybody who's been scrolling on Twitter the past few months could definitely understand what I'm talking about. Again, it's not a personal attack on McCagg, it's just pointing out language that he uses in some of his tweets. But I wanted to talk about Connor McDavid from the 2015 Erie Otters that was an absolute monster, as well as Dylan Strome, and why anybody would think that Dylan Strome would have been better. Now, both of these guys played on the Erie Otters in that team. They played in the same season, and they played, I think, on the same line as well. My mind is a little bit blank on this because it was 7 years ago, but I do recall some footage of McDavid and Strome skating on a pairing together. But back in 2015, everybody kind of knew that Connor McDavid was going to be, the next best thing. There were articles back in 2013, for example, on Sportsnet magazine talking about how this young dude, Connor McDavid, who was 15 years old at the time, was going to be better than Crosby. As a result, when you take a look at the 2015 draft rankings, I mean, look, Future Considerations had McDavid at 1, ISS had McDavid at 1, McKeen's had McDavid at 1. He was the first-ranked Central Scouting North American skater, as well as number 1 on the Bob McKenzie list. He was even drafted into the KHL, and that never happens for NHL talent. It usually only happens for the good guys. In fact, Dylan Strome actually was drafted by the KHL draft too. He was drafted 202nd overall by Magnitogorsk, but that's besides the point. Dylan Strome, back in the 2015 season, was ranked 4th by Future Considerations, 3rd by ISS, 7th by McKeen's. He was the 4th best skater by NHL Central Scouting, and he was 5th on TSN and Bob McKenzie's list. He went 3rd overall to the Arizona Coyotes behind McDavid and Eichel. Now, if you go over to that 2015 season, Connor McDavid did not play the whole year. He missed out on a good chunk, I believe, because he got in a fight and he broke his hand or something like that in the fight. He had 120 points in 47 games played. It was over a goal a game. He was way over 2 points a game. He was almost at 3 points a game. He did come back in the playoffs, and he had 49 points in 20 games in that sample as well. Meanwhile, Dylan Strome in the 2014-15 season had 129 points in 68 games. So we only had 9 more points than Connor McDavid, but he did so in 20 more games. Strome in this season also had over a point per game in the postseason. He had 22 points in 20 games. Definitely not at the same caliber, though, as Connor McDavid, who had 50. Now, even though Dylan Strome did not produce as well as Connor McDavid did, Dylan Strome still produced like crazy. That season, he was the number 1 point producer in the entire OHL, and it's pretty much only because McDavid was out for a good chunk of the year. He had more points than Mitch Marner, and so Mitch Marner actually went 4th overall to the Toronto Maple Leafs after Strome. But Strome, back in this time frame, was a big-bodied, offensively skilled center who had some really good projectable qualities into the National Hockey League. At his best, he could be just an absolute force out there, a play-driving machine who could score goals, set up other teammates, as well as power around the offensive zone because he was a big dude. He wasn't as fast as McDavid. In fact, nobody was. Strome instead was a player who dominated when the puck was on his stick and who was able to set guys up against weaker OHL talent. You saw this really come to life the next season when Connor McDavid made his NHL debut. Dylan Strome stayed behind. He had 111 points in 56 games and 21 points in 13 games in the playoffs for the Erie Otters, playing alongside of Alex DeBrincat. But as the years have gone on, Dylan Strome really has not shown off the same level of success in any capacity at the NHL level. Sure, he was a really good AHL player, over a point per game with the Tucson Roadrunners in, his draft plus 1, 2, 3 season. It wasn't until he was traded over to Chicago when he actually broke out and had a 51-point campaign in 58 games played. Certainly not in the same caliber of what you would expect a 2-point per game guy in his draft year to get down the line, but it still was a step in the right direction. The next few years kind of saw Dylan Strome fall off a cliff a little bit in terms of point production, and that really came to life last year, where he had 17 points in 40 games played. This season, though, he was back up to 20 goals. He scored 22 in 69 games, so a pretty nice amount of games played, and he had 48 points on the year. Certainly not bad, but, I mean, Connor McDavid just won the Art Ross with 123 points. He had 105 points in 56 games last year. Connor McDavid is in a completely other world than Dylan Strome, and in fact, for Strome, you could say that he definitely should not have been taken 3rd overall at all anymore. Mitch Marner had a crazy good career. You have Zach Werenski, who was taken after. You also have Rantanen, Timo Meier. These guys were fantastic. Noah Hanifin is not really as good as he probably could have been, as he was taken 5th overall by Carolina, but he's still pretty all right. And then you go down even further, you have the Matthew Barzals, the Connors, the Shabots, the Brock Bessers. There are a lot of other players here who are much, much better than Dylan Strome today. Obviously, I'm still cheering for Dylan Strome to become the best version of himself. It's just, for a guy who produced as well as he did in the OHL, he has not looked as great. Connor McDavid, on the other hand, has been all that and more. So for Grant McCagg back in 2015, check back in a couple of years and see who's laughing because I have Strome over McDavid. Yeah, I think everybody else is kind of laughing over here. Sorry, Grant. There are so many other takes that are included in this Reddit post that are just kind of hilarious that we might have to make more videos about it. But at the end of the day, I just wanted to make this video because of the entire Shane Wright Slafkovsky thing that's been going on as well, because of how over-scouted some of these prospects can be and what it could actually do to their psyches heading into the draft. I mean, they're supposed to be pro athletes by this time next year, so I guess you could say, oh, they have to get used to it, but at the same time, come on, some of these kids are 17 years old. So talk to me in the comments on your thoughts about Strome and McDavid, how Shane Wright's parents have deleted social media because of all the conversations, and how, in my opinion, the guy that is kind of at the head of that is the guy who made this take earlier in his career. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Juraj Slafkovsky, and bye.